Alright my dudes, I'm Exelia and welcome to my channel. Come in, get comfy and let's chat about garage kits. Hi, I'm Heather and today's video is going to be a little bit different. Normally I talk about cosplay on this channel, but I wanted to talk about something that I've been really into recently, and that is garage kits. So if you're not familiar with garage kits, these are figures that you build and paint yourself. So they come, I'll show you. Typically they come like this, so they come in little bags and there's individual pieces, so it's up to you to sand them down, clean them up, prime them, paint them, seal them, and end up with a finished figure. So in this video I'm going to show you how I painted these two. That is Kotoko and Sumomo from Chobits. In the past I have cosplayed Sumomo, I'll put an image up somewhere, and I really love her design. When I was looking for a figure kit I was absolutely determined to get Sumomo, and I did end up finding one that had Sumomo and Kotoko, so I figured it was worth getting both. I am by no means an expert. This is only the second kit that I've ever built, but I want to give a massive shout out thank you to Leona's workshop, because without her videos I would have been totally clueless. If you want to follow her work, I will have it down in the description below, and I highly recommend going and checking out her channel because she has videos for beginner guides and what you need to get started, and also just general like walkthroughs of how she paints kits, which I found really interesting and also really helpful because it showed me the rough like order to do things in. So the first kit that I painted was Noelle from Tenshini Naramon. I was pleasantly surprised that it turned out not totally rubbish. So after I painted her I went on a little bit of a kick and I decided to order some more kits and just see who I could get. I think I've rambled enough at this stage, so let's get started. I started with a kit from E2046 of Sumomo and Kotoko from Chobits. It came with a reference photo and a slip which showed all of the parts that should be present inside the box. Everything was bubble wrapped really well and pieces were separated into individual parts inside the box, so it was really easy to see all of the parts, inspect all the pieces and make sure that everything was there. It took about 2 weeks for them to actually dispatch the kit, but as soon as it was sent it arrived in a week, so it was pretty speedy. I did get this kit from a recast website, which I'm not particularly proud of. Most of the kits that I have are originals and I like to support the originals if I can, but I did look for this kit and I could not find it for love nor money. So unfortunately I did get a copy of it. Once I'd unboxed it, I laid all the pieces out as it shows on the sheet and made sure that everything was there. I inspected all the parts to see if anything needed sanding, clipping, any extra putty work, if anything was broken, but everything arrived pretty safely, nothing was damaged at all. And of course I couldn't resist putting some of the pieces together just to see, you know, roughly what she'd look like. So the first step when building a garage kit is a dry fit. So this is where you take the pieces that you get out of the box and you try and build the figure as best as you can. This is one of the most important parts of the process because it shows you if there's any pour tabs from where the kit has been made, or if there's anything that needs putty filling or adjusting. As you can see here, I was using some side cutting pliers and also a craft knife to clean up some of the pour tabs that are on Sumomo to get a nice clean fit. Some of the tabs pinged off with a lot of force, so I probably should have worn some goggles, but once I knew how everything was going to fit together for Sumomo, I decided to move on to Kotoko. You can see a little time lapse here of the whole process of me putting Kotoko together, just to get a rough idea of how long it takes and how complicated it is. So all garage kits have some kind of mold release on them. This is basically like a silicone or a Vaseline that allows it to pop out of the mold really easily. But unfortunately, when you go to paint a kit, this will stop your paint from sticking, so it's really important to get it cleaned. I left it overnight in a tub of water with some Vanish. Once I'd given every piece a good scrub, I put it into a sieve and then rinsed it under the shower to make sure that everything was nice and clean. Here's a fancy flat lay of some of the parts. At the top we've got the pieces for Kotoko. We've then got some 2mm aluminium wire. We've got some side cutting and some long nose pliers. This is a pin vise, which is what I used for all of the hand drilling. You can use a Dremel, but I'm a scrub, so I used a pin vise, and some different size drill bits. Kotoko has these long pigtails and they're very heavy, so it was difficult to get them to just stick to the model. I used the pin vise by hand to be able to drill a hole into the pigtails, as you can see here. And then I created a mirroring hole in the base hairpiece. Using the pliers, I cut a piece of wire that I then inserted into the hairpiece and then into the pigtail. As you can see here, the pigtail is now nice and sturdy. I added pins to pretty much every joint on these figures, as you'll see as I continue through the video. It just gives it a bit more strength and a bit more structure. I used two types of putty on this project, the first one being Milliput and a lot of Vaseline. There's a little gap in the top of Sumomo's hair where the pieces just don't quite join up. Adding Vaseline to the side of the figure that you don't want anything to stick to means that the putty will only stick to one side, but you can get a nice clean cast. Added Milliput to the front side of the hair to be able to fill in the gap. Once the Milliput was on, I squeezed the two sides together to be able to get a perfect cast. I then filled in the gap with a little bit of extra Milliput, smoothed it over with my finger and also with a silicone tool. It's a little messy here, but you can see that the gap isn't there anymore. I also added some Milliput to Sumomo's legs to bridge a little gap between the thighs. Once the pieces were pressed together, I cleaned that up with a craft knife and again with the silicone tools. The next putty I used was Tamiya Putty White. This putty was a little bit different. It's a lot more goopy than Milliput was, and personally I didn't really get on with it, but the Milliput that I was using had hardened, so I figured I would try a different one. I used this to fill a gap between Kotoko's sleeves on both sides of the torso, and it's not the cleanest looking putty job, but it certainly filled the gap. All of the pieces on the left didn't need any putty work, and the ones that are on the right did have putty work done. So about half the kit. I used some isopropyl alcohol and some cotton swabs to be able to clean off the kit. If you don't do this, well, it's going to do the same job as the mold release, isn't it? And your paint isn't going to stick, so get in there. I used some wet and dry sandpaper in 400 and 800 grit to be able to sand the pieces. Resin is quite a soft plastic, so it's relatively easy to sand even with quite a fine sandpaper, and it means that everything will turn out nice and smooth. There were some little lumps and bumps where I'd removed tabs, so sanding those pieces was also very satisfying. At this stage I decided to re-drill some of the holes to make sure that they were nice and deep and they would be able to support the pins. I made sure not to drill too deep because, as you can see here, there's a little shadow where I insert the drill. If I'd went any further, it would have poked through the resin. I also decided to add a pin to Sumomo's legs because the leg that inserted into the main trousers didn't have any kind of pinhole at all, so this would just give a little bit of extra support. Once I knew the pin would fit correctly, I filled it in with some putty, and once that was dry, I sanded it again. The sash for Sumomo had some really small holes in it, so I decided to use a triangular file from a diamond file set to be able to clean that up. And once all that filing and sanding and extra work was done, I could finally clean up. I used Tamiya surface primer in white to be able to prime the surface for the kit. I used alligator clips and wire to be able to hold up the pieces and make sure that I wasn't touching anything, so the primer would go on nice and smooth. And for some of the larger pieces, I used bamboo skewers because it did the same job. So once I primed everything, I wanted to make sure that everything was going to fit. I cut pins for each of the pieces and made sure that everything would actually fit together, and if there was any more filling or any more adjustment that needed to be done, I was going to do it now. The pin I put in the front of Kotoko's bow actually chipped through the resin. Thankfully it's not very noticeable, it's also hidden by hand, but yeah, not great. Using aluminium wire was also really easy for a beginner like me, because for things like Sumomo's head where it needs to bend, I could just bend the wire rather than trying to put things in on a more awkward angle. Lily was very happy to be allowed back in the room as well. Now I wasn't working with resin dust, it was all good for the cats. On to the fun bit. So I used normal acrylic paint, and I also used an acrylic thinner, and I mixed my paints together just as you normally would and got to work. I used some synthetic detail brushes that I got from Amazon, and I started with the skin first. Using a thinner means that the layers go on really nice and smoothly, and it reduces brush strokes. Bub was getting very comfortable in here too. And so it begins, the many layers of varnish to come. I used a matte acrylic varnish from Humbrol, and I made sure that I put some nice thin but even coats on each piece. I'm really impatient, so I wanted to get the faces done as soon as possible because that's what gives the characters character, isn't it? I managed to record most of the process of doing Kotoko's face, so hopefully this will give you a little bit of insight of how I did it. Most of it was just stippling dots, to be honest, but it turned out pretty effective. And as you can see, I did the same for Sumomo and also gave them some cute little brows. So once the faces were done, it was time to paint everything else. Applying more than one colour on top of pieces that have already been varnished makes it easier if you do have to clean anything up or if you make any mistakes, because that way you can just wash it off the varnish instead of washing it off the whole piece. I used some fine brushes to be able to clean up where different colours met on the pieces. This made it a lot easier to get nice crisp lines. Though I do still have shaky hands. This is how Sumomo's torso was looking with all those nice clean lines. All of the paint was applied in 3 separate layers, so I would start with the base layer, then I would add at least 2 more layers on top depending on the opacity of the paint. But for more detailed pieces like this, only 1 or 2 passes was needed. Eventually Lily came in and forced me to have a break. Thanks, Lily. Yeah, you just tear up that chair. Go on. As you can see, I'm not the tidiest painter. A lot of it is pretty slapdash, but as long as the final strokes are nice and clean, then it's, you know, it's all good. Small, fluffy quality control. Nope. Yep, she's gone. Yep, more varnish. Pretty much every piece that I've painted at this stage got varnished here. And here's everything laid out. So as you can see, most of the base colours were on, it was just the details to go. I used Tamiya masking tape to mask off some of the details on Kotoko that needed straight lines. And it bled anyway. Ugh. Most of the cleanup was on Kotoko's torso. There was a lot of bleed on both the red and the white, so I had to clean up a lot of the details here. Here's a little comparison, so as you can see, it's a lot cleaner once I went in with a brush. Knowing just how messy it got with the torso, I got to the bells and frankly I didn't care if I made a mess on the hair because I would just clean it up by hand anyway. So you can see me just slapping some paint on and then cleaning it up. Here's a little comparison again. This is what it was looking like first, and here it was once I cleaned it up by hand. Oh, the swirls. Yeah, this was one of the most tedious parts of the whole process. So Sumomo has little swirls on her sash, and there's two sides of the sash, so there are 4 swirls in total. And it took me a long time to do all of these manually. I did overline on some of them, so they're a little bit messy, but it looks fine when she's displayed. Yep, it was time to seal these pieces, and then it was time to move on. To create some highlights and some shadows, I used some Faber-Castell soft pastels. I scraped some of the pastels using a utility knife and a palette to create a fine dust to be able to add some shading. Most garage kits are going to have places that are obvious that need shading, so things like between the fingers, inside the ears, in folds of clothing, that sort of thing. So more than anything, I was just following the figure as a guide and adding shading where I thought was appropriate. To get rid of the excess powder, I blew on it and then I used a powder brush to sweep it off. Most of the pastels that I used were a mix of purple, brown and black. So for example on Sumomo's hair, I used purple with black to be able to shade and add definition. I also added some highlights using white. Around the back of her hat, I added a little bit of definition where the hat would actually sit to make it look more realistic. Most of the folds on Sumomo were really easy to follow, so adding definition wasn't difficult. With Kotoko, I used black to shade her hair. And I used brown for the details on the bells. This is why spray varnish is so important for these figures, because each piece has already been varnished. It allows the pastels to be able to stick to the surface without moving too much, and it creates a really soft textured look. This was by far the messiest part of the process. I wanted to add some shine, so I added some Tamiya clear gloss. This was mostly for the eyes. I added 2 separate layers to the eyes and detailed it around the eyelashes too. Sumomo's looking pretty happy about it. And I did the same for Kotoko. Added gloss to the beads on Sumomo and also the buttons on a hat. And also on the bells for Kotoko to make them nice and shiny. Once everything was shaded, glossed and varnished for a final time, it was time to glue it all together. I used a gel Loctite super glue. This meant that when I applied it to the pieces, it wasn't going to run off and ruin any of the paint job, and it was nice and exact. The glue dries quite quickly, so it was quite easy to just put the pieces together and then leave it to dry. When gluing the pieces together, I initially glued the pins in one side of the kit, allowed those to dry for a while, and then assembled the rest. So let's have a look and see how they turned out. So there we have it. My kits of Sumomo and Kotoko from Chobits, all done. I learned a lot during this process, and one of the main things, which I'm not sure how well it came across in the video, is that I wanted to really get the hairlines nice and clean. There's a really obvious seam on top of her head, which isn't really what I was intending. I don't think they turned out terribly, they look rather cute on my desk. And there's a lot of things that when I build my next garage kit I'm going to take note of and do slightly differently. Aside from some little mistakes like the pinning, so for example Kotoko's bow, which was in the video, I didn't make that many mistakes, which I was pleasantly surprised by. But I do also feel like even though this kit is, I made two figures at the same time. Idiot. Even though there were a lot of pieces to this kit, it was actually quite easy to put together, and as I said before, they were all kind of block colours and block pieces, and for example like Sumomo, her outfit only uses like 4 colours or something, so it was relatively easy to put together. It wasn't too intricate or too difficult. And now I've got some little backdrop buddies. Thank you if you sat and watched through all of that. I really hope you found it satisfying, because as someone who enjoys watching like the process of how people make things, that's really what I was trying to emulate in this video, and just showing you how I actually did things, whether it was like really basic steps or if it was like little mistakes and stuff like that, just to give you an insight of how it went. I'm really curious if any of you guys watching have attempted a garage kit, if you're considering doing a garage kit, if you do anything similar like Warhammer or any kind of miniature painting, because it's so cool. And this is the sort of hobby where once upon a time I was like, who on earth would want to do that? And now I love it. So if you're into this sort of thing, please do comment below, because I would love to have a chat. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up, that really, really helps. And if you haven't already, if you would like to subscribe and see some more cosplay chatter or garage kit building or whatever the hell I upload here, then please do subscribe and hit the bell to be notified every time I upload a new video. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you very, very soon.